Welcome to another episode of Bot Meets World, where we take all the week's news in AI and distill it down into about a 10 to 15 minute audio segment, and you can learn everything you need and feel smart and get some hot takes along the way. A quick little side personal note, I am broadcasting from the road. I'm in my original bedroom of my original family home that I grew up in, and the heartwarming side story here is that my father is a coder. So I grew up with this, and he's been a coder since the 80s. And we nerd out so much. And this time we're nerding out about OpenAI, and it's wholesome. It's heartwarming. I love it. And for you guys out there, even if your parents are not hardcore coders, take the time to show them these things about ChatGPT and Bard and how to use it. And take it upon yourself to go and have these kinds of engaging interactions with the people around you who might not know as much as you do about this field, because the entire world is changing. And it's on us to ensure that our families and those in the generations above us, who are not even in our families, but just everyone in this, in our wider circles, is aware and knows how to use these new technologies. All right, so without further ado, I have so much to cover. My gosh, we're going to go into this paper released, this leaked paper from an employee at Google that basically says that Google has no moats and speaks about the open source community with AI. So that's a big shocker there. We'll go through that. We'll talk about Starcoder, the Biden administration and what they're doing with AI this week. There's an update from Replika. There's a new AI assistant from Pi, from the original founder of DeepMind that was acquired by Google and that started this entire LLM spree. And then I want to touch on two apps that are really practical and useful that you can use. One's called Akkio, one is Browse.AI. I also want to touch on the writer's strike and how that is affecting AI. If you're not sure, if you're not in the LA area, there's a major strike of all the screenplay writers. And one of their big demands is how to handle AI going forward. And the ramifications of what comes out of that negotiation will affect everything for AI's credits and how we accept AI in all forms of art, whether it's movies or I assume it'll affect music and certainly art as well. I'll finish with a prompt of the day. And so if you do anything in product research, product development, you'll want to stick around for that piece at the end. This was an incredible tip I picked up on Twitter for a cool way to use ChatGPT. All right, let's start from the top. So this week, we got a leak, and if you were on Twitter yesterday, anyone and everyone that follows AI has been passing this thing around. Basically, it is an employee at Google who wrote this long-form article that claims that Google has no moat, and that firms like Google, that big private companies, are at risk at being dethroned by the open source community. And he points to what happened with image generation, where DALL-E by OpenAI is a closed system, and it got all the headlines late last year. But then the open source community, led by Stable Diffusion and others, really moved much faster and iterated way quicker. And now we have so much more image generation tools out there that are outside the realm of OpenAI. And the same thing he claims is going to be happening in the text generation and all the GPTs because of this tech called LoRA, low rank adaptation of large language models, which basically allows you to take a base model and quickly iterate it without needing millions of dollars worth of compute power. He's giving examples and giving claims to how devs and engineers around the world have just been tinkering around, and they're able to use hardware as small as their laptop and oftentimes as small as their phones to iterate on these models. And his point is that the open source wider community will create far more iterations and far more specific models and far more granular models and much more use cases than the core big companies ever will. Now, to me, there's a lot of hoopla around this leak, and it's sexy to say that a Google engineer leaks this, but it misses the point. If you've been in any of the VC meetings in the last 6 months, every VC says the same thing. There are no moats in AI. So this is not new. The tech that this is all based on is all open source. So where does the moat come from? Well, the moat comes from Rails and data. So data meaning who has the actual access to data on which to make the training, but also the fine tuning. And then more importantly than even the training and the fine tuning is the customer data itself. So let's say you are creating an assistant that helps someone with their CRMs, like someone in sales will manage all their leads. You have to have access to all those leads. So if you are an incumbent like Salesforce, which I'll cover later, you already have access to all those CRM leads. And so your AI on day one already is far more capable and far more useful to users than some new startup that's popping off elsewhere and has a cool new fancy model, because you actually have access to the user's data that makes you useful. Then there's the ability to get to those users. So it's the data of the users and the trust and the access to those users. So again, on day one, Salesforce already has millions of users, as opposed to a new startup or a new company has to acquire all those users. And so as I tweeted a couple of weeks ago, AI is not a new medium like social media was to acquire new customers, where incumbents are out of luck because they need to figure out how to acquire customers a different way. This is more of a back-end protocol or a middle layer logic protocol. And so if you already have the users, it's not that difficult to develop or apply these AI principles and offer them to your existing users. I mentioned Salesforce. So Salesforce has Einstein GPT, and Slack just this week announced SlackGPT. And so for anyone who's been building various Slack bots that incorporate these large language models and let you, chat in your Slack teams to LLMs, you're now out of luck because it's built in natively in Slack, or at least it will be very shortly. And so my point there is, yes, the open source community will iterate much faster and will create all sorts of incredible use cases and models. And that is the biggest takeaway from this paper. But I don't think it's fair to say that the incumbents have no moats. They have incredible moats, and their moats are the access to the user's data and the access to the users themselves. And that will continue to be true. All right, next. The right way to go from here would be to go into more open source things, because we talked about Salesforce. So on the open source side, Starcoder. So Starcoder is an open source code generator. So last week I talked about using ChatGPT to help you write code, using Bard to help you write code. Now we have Starcoder, which is open source, and they trained their model based on this thing called the stack, which contains 19 million fully permissible code bases. And so you don't have to worry about using something that was trained on someone's code that you were not supposed to have access to, as has been accused of OpenAI and possibly their partnership with GitHub. Another throwback or callback is Replit, which I talked about last week. I mentioned how they've integrated AI code generation into their platform last week. This week, they just announced Replit LM. So another code generator built in-house from their own base model. And this is, again, an example of how companies that already have access to customer data, right? Like Replit has access to all these code bases because Replit is the IDE. For those who don't know, Replit is this online studio where you can go and write code as if you're working with Google Docs, right? And so multiple engineers can use Replit to code together and then quickly deploy. So Replit already has access to so many code bases, and so that gives them this ability to fine-tune and train their own models. All right, switching gears completely, I want to go into government. Biden. So Biden's administration is getting in front of AI, and I'm really proud of them for doing this, because what we don't want to happen is what happened back in Web3. So in Web3 and in crypto, we're seeing a reckoning now where for years, the government didn't really take any positions on what's legal, what's not legal, how filings should be made. And so now you're seeing lawsuits and criminal suits against companies for doing things that in retrospect are now viewed as illegal based on what the government has passed in terms of laws and regulations today. But at the time, it was gray. It was unclear. And so in AI, Biden's administration is getting ahead of the matter. And this week they announced the National Science Foundation announced $140 million in funding to launch 7 new national AI research institutes. In addition, they got an independent commitment from leading AI developers. This includes Anthropic, Google, Hugging Face, Microsoft, NVIDIA, OpenAI, Stability AI, all the big players to participate, and this is incredible, in a public evaluation of AI systems. In other words, they are going to submit their models for evaluation by a platform developed by Scale AI to conform and to be consistent with responsible disclosure principles. So the point here is that the US understands that there is some risk here, risk of bias, risk of just models going astray. And somehow they've managed to corral the leaders in the space to work together and create this framework and abide by this framework. And this is incredibly useful and helpful because the flip side of this, what could have happened is silence from the government, having all these companies go run amok and create all their models. And then a year or two later, the government retroactively creating some laws that now make all of these companies act illegally in retrospect. And that would be really bad for the industry. I also want to draw a contrast between what the US is doing and what the EU is doing. So if you remember, the EU, I think Italy started this and others followed, basically banned OpenAI's ChatGPT for privacy reasons and other reasons. And banning would be the other extreme, right? So if you don't regulate at all and don't think about it at all, that's fully open. That's not so great. Banning is also not so great because banning just slows down progress, and others around the world will keep moving that progress forward. Even within the EU, I'm sure there's a bunch of coders and engineers who are still tinkering with this stuff. And so, but one piece of news that I will share about OpenAI in the EU is that if you are in the EU, OpenAI now offers a GDPR opt-out form. So if prompts entered into ChatGPT are responding with your name and your likeness, you can actually send them a takedown request or send them a removal request, and they will adjust their algorithms to not include your name and your likeness in the response, which is a pretty big deal. And hats off to OpenAI for supporting that kind of minutia, that kind of really detailed tweaking on the customer side. All right, next thing I want to talk about is Pi from Inflection. So Mustafa Suleyman, who is the founder of DeepMind. DeepMind is the company that was bought by Google a long time ago, and that started this entire push into LLMs. So left Google, went to Greylock, the VC firm, and then he and Reid Hoffman, my gosh, created this company called Inflection. And the seed round for this, led by Greylock, was $225 million. Now, the fact that it's called the seed round is completely insane because the seed round should be like $1 million plus or minus. So this is a wacky name, but the point of Pi is to create this AI personal assistant chatbot, kind of like that movie Her, that pop movie Her, but it's this bot that you can speak to conversationally that doesn't give you 5 answers to each question, but actually answers your question like a real human would, and you develop that relationship with your AI. I wanted to comment on this because I built something similar to this called Catherine. This was about 2 months ago. I fine-tuned models around this. And what I found is when you speak to an AI, even conversationally, it comes off as bland, boring, and somewhat annoying. And a part of this is that these large language models are creating an average human. But our friends, our closest relationships are not with the average human. We choose to interact with the people that engage us, with the kind of people that challenge us, with the kind of people that we find uniquely fascinating. And so you need to fine tune these assistants, not just on the average human, but on these very specific traits that we look for in our friends. Now, Replika, who you might have heard about, they're the ones that started a few years ago. The backstory there is that the founder of Replika lost her best friend in a tragic accident, and she basically recreated him as an AI, and that started off the company, and they created these assistants, these chatbots that you could form a relationship with. Over time, you could form intimate relationships with them. And there was a big drama a few months ago when I think it was Italy again led the charge for taking this down, but Replika turned off its intimate chat feature, and a lot of people got angry and got depressed and felt that they'd lost their best friend. The reason I bring all this up is one thing that Replika learned is they actually had the chat assistant or the chat friend learn over time to reflect and sound more like you. Let me repeat that again. Replika figured out that you want to talk to yourself. And so they, over time, would fine tune your AI friend to sound more or less like you. And so that's one way of doing it. And it's a little weird. It makes sense psychologically. But I hypothesize that what we really want is a collection of friends, that one friend is not enough. As Esther Perel pointed out in her Mating in Captivity book, one human in our lives can't serve all 5 purposes. And so I believe where the future of this is going is we will have a series of AI assistants, chatbots, and friends, possibly, if this is where we want it to go. But each one will have a slightly different personality. I mean, maybe one of those will be kind of fine-tuned on us, and that will serve as kind of a check and balance on ourselves, by ourselves. But then we'll have a series of these AI friends that are not like us, that will challenge us, that will push us, and that will be the devil and angel on our shoulder as we think through the hard parts of life. All right. Wow. That was a tangent I did not expect, but hopefully you found that valuable. I'm going to shift gears again and mention 2 apps that I discovered that I think you should try. One is called Browse.AI. That's Browse, BROWSE.AI. And so I came across this because I was looking for a tool that would let me scrape websites. The reason I was looking for this is because so much of AI work requires data, requires accessing a person's LinkedIn profile, requires accessing the information on a website, on a Shopify page, and then processing it somehow. And so Browse.AI is this really powerful tool that lets you train an AI bot visually. So it's like a Chrome extension, and it'll let you train it what data you wanted to extract from a certain web page or website. And then it pulls that into either directly into your other tools, or like Zapier, like Google Sheets, whatever it is, or it creates a quick API layer against that bot. In other words, you train a bot to crawl a certain page or website that you need access to, and then that bot exposes a series of, let's say, commands or an API that lets your app query against this API automatically behind the scenes and pull that data automatically. And you can even have this Browse.AI bot keep a lookout for any changes that happen on that website, and your app can be privy to and can collect those changes as they happen. So either you can pull the data once or on a weekly basis or a monthly basis, or you can pull data when there's a change on that site. So really powerful way to extract data from any part of the internet. The second app I wanted to bring to your attention is Akkio. That's AKKIO.com. Akkio. The reason I like these guys is when I first started digging into AI, I started with machine learning, like actual ML. And the promise of actual ML is that if you have a bunch of data, you can predict things. So if you're a company that is an insurance company and you need to predict loss, you have a bunch of inputs like the driver's driving history, like the driver's age, like the driver's education level, whatever it is. And you have some outputs of number of accidents. And you need to create this massive ML model. And there's so many facets of tuning this model. There's lots of different models you can use. And it's like, that is data science. And that is what the science part of machine learning is. And it's really hard to know and learn. And what Akkio does is it does it for you. It's incredible. You connect it to your data sources. You tell it what the inputs are. You tell it what the output, the target is, aka accident or no accident. And it will figure out on its own which model is the best fit and turn that model that it's created about from your data into its own API endpoint. So now your actual app can go in and fill in future data. So you create the model based on training data. You can send in a future data point of inputs, and it'll send you back the outputs based on the ML model that it just trained and created for you. So if you've done anything in ML, in like the true hardcore ML of predicting outputs based on inputs, you will really find this useful. All right, next and almost last thing, before we get to the prompt of the day, I want to touch on the writer's strike. So there's a writer's strike happening. And the reason I wanted to touch on this is because a big part of their negotiation is what happens when a screenplay is written by AI. And what the Writers Guild is strongly lobbying for is that AI cannot be credited with writing a screenplay. Meaning, no matter how much involvement AI played in writing the screenplay, a human must be credited. And that human will collect all the royalties and economics of that screenplay and of that movie, even if the AI wrote 99% of that screenplay. The implications of this, I believe, are massive. This feels like we are artificially propping up an industry. We're artificially propping up a specific kind of worker, of employee, of creative, and saying, no matter what happens in tech, you are guaranteed to make the same amount of money from each movie that is created. And I believe this is dangerous precedent, because you can imagine this extending to all sorts of other fields. And it feels anti-progress. It feels to me that the future is not to just artificially require the economics to go back to the same person as before, but to encourage this person to use AI or use their technology, whatever that is, to create newer and better media. That's what we've always done in the past, and I hope that that's how we settle in the future. Maybe this is an interim step to give us time, to buy us time, but I'm just worried about the precedent that this sets for us. All right, I promised us a prompt of the day, and the prompt of the day is for market research. So if you are launching a new app or a new product, and you need to go and perform research, you need to go and survey 100 doctors, or survey 50 lawyers, or survey 30 accountants and get their input on a certain feature set. Instead of doing that, you can actually start 30 conversations with ChatGPT or a different LLM saying, you are a doctor. You are a doctor who is 35 years old with a practice with 300 patients and a staff of 5. Let's discuss this new possible feature. And so you can actually use LLMs to create personas of the kinds of people that you want to survey and ask them the same questions that you would ask in a typical product feedback survey or user input survey, and do this in a much more scalable way without ever having to leave your house. Now, is this perfect? No. Do you still have to go out and talk to real people? I hope so. But if in the past you had to speak to 30 people, now you might only have to speak to 5 or 10, and then the other quote unquote people you talk to can just be prompt engineered bots that are representative of those humans in those vocations. I think this is actually really nice because remember, as I mentioned earlier, LLMs are like the average human, right? They've gleaned from all the world's information to understand how that average doctor, average attorney, average nurse, average tradesperson thinks and feels and believes and would answer. And so if you want to know how your average customer would think about this product or how your average customer thinks about the challenges in their lives, this is a really great way to conduct research. All right, that's it. I'm sorry, it's been a longer episode than normal. I got a little carried away on everything from the Google leaks to what's happening in government and the points about creating a personal relationship with an AI. I hope this was useful for you. If this was, please share it with someone in your life that is also interested in AI. I would really appreciate that. And until next time, take care.